There is a particular kind of person who has never spoken about their deepest wound, not because they lack the words, but because, somewhere in the architecture of their suffering, they learned that the wound itself was unspeakable. They carried it the way a river carries sediment invisibly, beneath the surface, shaping everything it touches without ever being seen. Carl Jung spent his life studying these people, and what he discovered was not what the world expected. He did not find ruins. He found the raw material of the most formidable human beings who ever lived. Jung understood early in his clinical work at the Bergholzli that the psyche does not simply absorb pain, it metabolizes it. It transforms it, not always cleanly, not always consciously, but with a relentless, almost terrifying purpose. In his collected works, he wrote of the psyche as a self-regulating system, one that perpetually seeks equilibrium between the light it can bear to show and the darkness it is forced to contain. And it is precisely in those individuals who are broken in silence, who receive no witness, no validation, no language for their inner devastation, that this self-regulation becomes the most extraordinary. But we must be precise about what this silence means. Jung was not speaking of ordinary introversion or mere reserve. He was speaking of a particular psychological condition, the experience of suffering that has been introduced, turned inward, denied its natural expression in the outer world. When a child, or a young person, or even an adult, encounters psychic wounding in an environment that offers no safe container for that wound, something decisive happens within the structure of the unconscious. The pain does not dissolve. It descends. It moves into the shadow. The shadow, as Jung formulated it in his extensive writings across the archetypes and the collective unconscious, is not simply the repository of moral failing or antisocial impulse, though it contains those things. More fundamentally, it is the sum of all that the ego cannot assimilate, all that cannot be acknowledged, expressed, integrated. And for those broken in silence, the shadow grows dense with unlived grief, unexpressed rage, and crucially, with extraordinary, unrecognized power. Because what is forced into the unconscious does not weaken. It intensifies. This is the paradox at the heart of Jung's understanding of suffering. The world assumes that those who have been broken are diminished, reduced, that the silence into which they retreat is a form of defeat. But Jung's psychology reveals precisely the opposite. When pain cannot move outward, it moves inward, and in moving inward, it begins to touch the deepest layers of the psyche. Layers that those who have never suffered in silence may never reach at all. Jung called the deepest organizing center of the psyche the self, and here he was careful to distinguish it absolutely from the ego. The ego is what we believe ourselves to be. The self is what we actually are, in totality, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown, light and shadow unified. And the path to the self, which Jung named individuation, is not a path of comfort. It is a path carved, inevitably, through encounter with precisely what the ego cannot bear. In psychological types, in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, in his autobiographical memories, dreams, reflections, Jung returned again and again to this essential truth, that the deepening of the personality requires a descent, a confrontation with the contents of the unconscious, a willingness to be undone. Those who are broken in silence have often already undergone this descent involuntarily. They did not choose it. It chose them. The wound arrived before they had any philosophical framework for understanding it, any psychological vocabulary for naming it. And yet, in surviving it, in continuing to function, to breathe, to move through time despite the silent devastation, they developed something that cannot be manufactured by any other means. Jung would recognize this as the beginning of psychological density, a depth of character that comes only from having lived close to the borderlands of dissolution and returned. Consider what Jung observed about the tension of opposites. He understood the psyche not as a harmonious whole, but as a field of dynamic tension between consciousness and the unconscious, between the persona and the shadow, between the ego's ambitions and the self's demands. And it is in those who have been broken in silence that this tension is most acute, most generative, because they carry within them simultaneously the knowledge of devastation and the will to endure, the capacity for suffering and the refusal to be consumed by it. This tension, held over years, over decades, becomes an inner forge. It tempers the psyche in ways that ordinary, unbroken life cannot approximate. The persona, that mask, that carefully constructed social identity Jung described as the functional face presented to the collective, is often thicker, more elaborately maintained, in those who have been wounded silently. They learned early that the inner world must be concealed, that vulnerability is dangerous, and so they constructed their persona with unusual skill, unusual care. They became, to all outward appearances, composed, capable, even formidable. While beneath that composure, something vast and largely unmapped was being continuously refined in darkness. This is not without its dangers. Jung was never naive about the costs of the unlived life, the unprocessed wound. He understood that what is repressed does not simply wait, patiently it erupts, projects, compels. The person broken in silence, who never confronts their shadow, will find that darkness expressing itself through compulsion, through the distorted relationships of transference and projection, through a life that seems to be driven by forces the ego cannot explain or control. The shadow unmet becomes the shadow unleashed. This is the risk. This is the burden of depth. But Jung also witnessed in his clinical practice, in his own extraordinary inner life documented with remarkable courage in his red book, the other possibility. He witnessed what happens when the person broken in silence begins, however tentatively, however painfully, to turn toward their own interior, to descend deliberately into what was forced upon them involuntarily, to meet the wound not as an enemy to be conquered, but as Jung would frame it, as a carrier of meaning, as a psychic event that contains within its very darkness something the conscious personality desperately needs. In Jung's framework, drawing from his understanding of alchemy and its psychological dimensions, the prima materia, the raw, unprocessed, often repulsive first substance, is precisely where the transformative work begins. The alchemists who most interested Jung were those who understood that gold is not found where the surface is clean and orderly. It is found in the chaos, in the darkness, in the material that every ordinary eye passes by as worthless. The psyche of those broken in silence is this prima materia, not despite their wound, because of it. There is something else that Jung observed about those who carry great psychic suffering without outward expression. He noticed in them a peculiar attunement, a sensitivity to what he called the collective unconscious, that vast, impersonal layer of the psyche that lies beneath the personal unconscious and connects every human being to the inherited symbolic life of the species. Those who have suffered in silence often develop what appears to the outer world as an uncanny intuition, a capacity to see beneath the surface of things, to perceive the emotional truth of a situation before any conscious evidence presents itself. Jung would understand this not as mystical gift but as psychological consequence. When you have had to read your environment with absolute precision simply to survive, when you have learned to detect danger, concealment, and hidden emotional content because your early survival depended upon it, you develop perceptual faculties that most people never have cause to cultivate. The anima and animus, those contrasexual archetypes through which the unconscious communicates its deepest contents to consciousness, speak with particular urgency and particular richness in those who have been broken in silence. Dreams grow dense with symbolism. The inner life becomes almost unbearably vivid. Precisely because the outer world offered no container, the inner world built one of its own. And in building it, in enduring it, in learning to navigate it without any guide, the person broken in silence develops an interiority so vast, so textured, so deeply cultivated that it becomes itself a source of extraordinary creative and psychological force. Jung believed that the second half of life, and he meant this not merely in chronological terms, but in terms of psychological development, is essentially a journey toward the self, toward the integration of all that was previously split off, denied, projected outward. And it is here, in this great work of integration, that those broken in silence often discover the full magnitude of what their suffering has been building, because they've already been in a relationship with the unconscious, already know its terrain not with comfort, but with hard-won intimacy. The journey of individuation that others must begin almost from the surface of things, they have already begun from somewhere far below. This does not mean their path is easier. In many ways it is harder. The contents accumulated in their unconscious are not minor. The wounds are real. The shadow material is dense. Jung never romanticized suffering. He never suggested that pain automatically and what he insisted upon were the precision of a clinician and the courage of a man who had walked through his own interior. Darkness, and returned transformed, was that suffering which is met, which is descended into consciously, which is alchemically worked upon through the process of individuation, does not remain merely suffering. It becomes something else. It becomes the foundation of a personality of genuine depth. And this is what the world senses in those people who have been broken in silence and who have, in their own way, survived that breaking. There is something in them that cannot be manufactured, cannot be performed, cannot be acquired through any curriculum or social achievement. It is the weight of a psyche that has been tested at its foundations and held. Not intact, not unchanged, but held. Jung would say it is the gravity of a soul that has touched the self, that has come into some degree of alignment with the totality of what it is, rather than merely the carefully maintained surface of what it wishes to appear to be. Those broken in silence carry within them the unspoken testimony of an inner life that has been forced, by the very absence of outer witness, to become its own witness, to develop its own authority, its own interiority, its own almost terrible clarity about the nature of what endures. And in a world that mistakes loudness for strength, performance for depth, and visible success for psychological development, these are the souls who carry something rare, something that Jung dedicated his life to naming, to mapping, to honoring. The deep life of the psyche, in all its suffering, in all its extraordinary, undefeatable generative power. If what you have heard in this reflection touches something you have never had the words for, if you recognize in Jung's understanding of the silent wound something that has been moving in you unnamed, then you already know what it is to live close to the self. What you carry is not a mark of failure. It is the signature of a particular kind of becoming. Stay with it. Descend into it consciously. That is where the gold has always been. If this channel speaks to something real in you, something that the surface of the world rarely addresses, subscribe. Share this with someone who carries more than they have ever been able to say. And if Jung's ideas have opened a door for you today, leave your reflection below. Because in the space where silence finally becomes language, something in us begins, at last, to heal.